A single merchant's word once moved mountains of goods across a continent. For centuries, a secretive alliance of trading cities wielded more power than kings and empires, yet it was never a country. This is the story of the Hanseatic League. By the end, you will understand how a network of trust and profit built a medieval superpower and secretly shaped our modern world. How did a league of merchants defeat royal armies? What hidden codes and sunken ships are still revealing its secrets today? What does it mean when money holds more power than a crown? The North Sea in the 12th century was a lawless highway. Viking raids had faded into memory, but the waters remained treacherous, ruled by weather and opportunistic pirates. Into this uncertainty sailed small bands of German merchants from towns like Cologne and Bremen. They were called Osterlings, men from the east, and they carried a new kind of courage, one measured not in swords but in silver and risk. Their goal was not conquest but connection, linking the emerging towns of the Baltic coast with the established markets of Western Europe. They traded in humble, essential goods, Baltic timber and wax for Flemish cloth and salt. Yet this simple exchange was the first thread in a tapestry of unprecedented power. The true catalyst, however, was not a ship but a city. In 1159, an ambitious duke named Henry the Lion refounded a settlement on a small river connecting to the Baltic Sea. He named it Lübeck. This was no accident. Henry understood that controlling trade was the future of power. Lübeck's location was a masterstroke, a perfect gateway between the North and Baltic Seas. He granted its merchants extraordinary privileges, freedom from many tolls, and the right to govern their own affairs. Lübeck was not just another trading post, it was a prototype, a commercial fortress designed from the ground up. It became a beacon, attracting merchants who saw in its laws a promise of safety and profit far from home. But a single city, no matter how prosperous, is vulnerable. The breakthrough, the moment often called the birth of the League, came in 1241. The cities of Lübeck and Hamburg, one on the Baltic and one on the North Sea, formed a formal agreement. On paper, it was a practical, even mundane pact. They promised to protect the road between them from bandits and to support each other against common threats, particularly the pirates who plagued the coastline. It was a mutual defense treaty for merchants, yet this compact was revolutionary. It recognized that their true wealth was mobile, carried on carts and ships, and that this wealth required a new kind of security that kings and local lords could not or would not provide. This was the seed. The agreement created a protected corridor, a safe lane across the narrow neck of the Jutland Peninsula, allowing goods to flow between seas without the deadly voyage around Denmark. So what were these early merchants actually moving? Picture the sheer physicality of it. From the east came enormous logs of dense Baltic timber, the skeleton for Europe's growing cities and ships. Came barrels of salted herring, a crucial source of protein for a fasting continent. Came beeswax for the candles that lit every church and manor. From the west came fine cloth from Flanders, and most importantly, salt from places like Lüneburg. Salt was the preservative that made everything else possible, the key to turning a seasonal herring catch into a year-round commodity. These were not luxuries for the few, they were the bulky, essential ingredients of medieval daily life. Their trade required not palaces but warehouses, not knights but accountants. This brings us to the core mystery from the very beginning. What exactly was the Hanseatic League? We search for a founding charter, a constitution, a single moment of creation, and we find none. It was never a country with fixed borders. It had no permanent army, no singular ruler. The word Hans itself is Old German, simply meaning a convoy or a guild of merchants. It was a fluid alliance, a network built on a shared commercial language and a profound mutual interest. It was less a state and more a system, a set of rules for doing business in a dangerous world. Its power was not written on parchment but in ledgers, and its loyalty was not to a flag but to a balance sheet. This inherent ambiguity, this shadowy, shifting nature, is what made it so resilient and so formidable. It was an empire of contracts, and its story was just beginning to be written in the ink of profit and the blood of salted fish. Their empire was built not on gold but on fish. To grasp the sheer scale of Hanseatic power, you must look inside their ships' holds at the humble, essential cargo that fueled a continent. The most famous of these was stockfish. This was not simply dried cod, it was a technological marvel of preservation. Cod caught in the icy waters off Norway were gutted and hung on wooden racks to be dried by the Arctic wind for months until they became rock-hard, lightweight slabs of pure protein. This process created a perfect commodity. It was non-perishable, easily transported, and could feed armies, sailors, and fasting populations for years. Control of the stockfish trade from Bergen, Norway, gave the Hanse merchants a nutritional monopoly over much of northern Europe, but the true spectacle of their commercial machine was further south at the Scania Peninsula. Each summer, the herring migration created one of the greatest economic events in the medieval world. Hundreds of ships and thousands of workers, from fishermen to salt packers to coopers, descended on the coast in temporary cities of commerce. The Hanse did not just show up to buy fish, they organized the entire operation. They provided the salt, they built the barrels, they enforced strict quality controls, and they owned the ships that carried the precious salted herring to markets from London to Novgorod. This was not trade, it was vertical integration centuries before the term existed. From the vast eastern forests came luxury and necessity. Think of the soft, dark glow of a beeswax candle in a cathedral. That light came from Hanseatic wax. The towering masts of European sailing ships were made from massive, straight Baltic timber, and from the depths of Russia came the ultimate luxury, furs. Sable, ermine, and marten pelts were not just clothing, they were walking bank accounts, symbols of status that flowed through Hanseatic counting houses into the courts of kings and queens. To pay for these eastern goods, the West sent its own treasures. From the looms of Flanders came fine, colorful cloth, the medieval equivalent of high fashion. From England came raw wool, the lifeblood of that Flemish industry. The Hanseatic merchant sat at the center of this whirlwind. His genius was understanding that moving goods was only the first step. True power lay in controlling the entire chain, from the quality of the salt used on a herring to the standard length of a piece of cloth. They created common weights, measures, and grades, a universal commercial language that allowed a merchant from Cologne to trust a contract written in Riga. By monopolizing the routes and setting the rules, they wove the disparate regions of Northern Europe into a single, functioning economy for the first time. This network of commodities was their true territory, and its capital was not a palace but the waterfront warehouse. The heart of this commercial empire beat on the open sea, aboard a vessel as distinctive as the League itself, the cog. Picture a ship with a single, square sail, a high, rounded hull, and a flat bottom. It looked almost tubby compared to the sleek Viking longships that had come before, but this design was a masterpiece of practical engineering. The flat bottom allowed it to sit upright on tidal mudflats for easy loading and unloading in shallow ports. The high sides made it a formidable floating castle, difficult for pirates to board. This was the 18-wheeler of the medieval Baltic, a slow, sturdy, and capacious beast that could carry hundreds of tons of cargo. To step aboard a cog was to enter a world of wood, rope, and overwhelming smell, the mingled scents of tar, wet wool, and the ever-present brine of the sea. Life for a merchant on such a voyage was a lesson in endurance and shared risk. He was not a passenger, he was part of the crew, investing his own capital in the cargo stacked in the hold beneath his feet. He slept in a cramped, dark cabin near the stern, if he was lucky, or more often simply found a spot among the barrels and bales. His world was the creak of timbers, the shout of the watch, and the constant, nagging fear of the weather. Navigation was an art of profound uncertainty. In open water, they steered by the sun and stars using simple wooden instruments. Near coastlines, a sailor would constantly swing a lead line, a weighted rope marked with knots, calling out the depth to avoid running aground on hidden sandbanks. A sudden storm could mean losing your ship, your fortune, and your life in a matter of hours. The dangers were not only natural. The seas swarmed with pirates like the notorious Victual Brothers, who began as privateers during a war and evolved into a ruthless brotherhood of freebooters preying on any ship they could catch. A merchant's defense was the cog's high sides, a few armed guards, and the hope of sailing in convoy with other Hanse ships. Yet even this perilous existence was governed by strict rules. The entire voyage operated under a binding contract called a sender brief. This document laid out every detail, the shares of each investor, the captain's responsibilities, even the penalties for drunkenness or negligence among the crew. It was a floating corporation where discipline and mutual trust were the only things standing between profit and disaster. When the long voyage ended, the merchant did not simply blend into a foreign city. He entered another specifically Hanseatic institution, the Kontor. These were fortified trading posts, extraterritorial islands of German commerce in the heart of foreign land. The most famous were the Steelyard in London, a walled compound on the Thames with its own wharves, warehouses and chapel, and the Peterhof in Novgorod, an even more isolated enclave surrounded by a wooden palisade where Hanse merchants lived almost like monks of commerce under their own laws. Inside a Kontor, life was highly regulated. Merchants lived in communal dormitories, shared meals, and were forbidden from marrying local women or engaging in trade outside the compound's rules. This isolation was strategic. It maintained a united front in negotiations, prevented internal competition from driving down prices, and created a closed, trusted community in a potentially hostile world. The Kontor was not a home, it was a diplomatic and commercial fortress, and from these outposts the League's influence quietly extended its roots deep into foreign soil. Their commercial empire had a signature written not in ink but in fired clay and mortar. Walk through the old town of Lübeck today, and you are walking through the physical manifestation of Hanseatic power, a cityscape of deep red brick. This was brick Gothic, and it transformed the cold, flat landscapes of the northern coast. Why brick? The answer is written in the very earth beneath these cities. The North German plain had no quarries for fine limestone or marble. What it had in abundance was clay, perfect for firing into sturdy, reliable bricks. This local material became a global statement. Using brick was a declaration of independence, a way to build monumental, lasting structures without relying on imports from the south. It was practical, yes, but it was also profoundly symbolic. The rich, warm color of the brick and the intricate patterns achieved by using glazed, dark blue or green bricks created a unique aesthetic, a northern answer to the stone cathedrals of France and Italy. It said, "Our wealth and our faith are built from the ground beneath our own feet." Consider the landmarks. The Holstentor Gate, with its two massive conical towers, is more than a postcard image. It was a billboard. Passing through this gate meant entering the wealthiest city in the Baltic, and its formidable appearance served as both a welcome to merchants and a stark warning to any who might threaten the peace within. Then there is St. Mary's Church, built by the merchants themselves, right next to the town hall. Its soaring vaults, the highest brick vaults in the world at the time, were a deliberate act of civic pride, a challenge to ecclesiastical authority, showing that the city's commercial elite could build a house for God that rivaled any bishop's cathedral. And everywhere, the skyline was punctuated by the stepped gables of merchants' houses. These were not just homes, they were combined headquarters, warehouses, and status symbols. The higher and more ornate the gable, the greater the merchant's standing. A silent competition played out in brick and terracotta. This architectural language was spoken fluently across the Hanseatic world. From Stralsund and Wismar on the German coast to Tallinn and Visby across the sea, you find the same blueprint, A large, open market square forms the heart, always adjacent to the towering town hall, the seat of merchant government. Facing the square is the main church, a testament to civic piety. Narrow streets lined with those tall, gabled houses radiate outward, leading directly to the waterfront and the warehouses. This was not accidental beauty, it was highly efficient urban planning for trade. Canals were dug to bring goods right into the city cellars. Massive wooden cranes, powered by men walking inside giant treadwheels, stood on the quaysides, loading and unloading the cogs. The entire city was a machine for moving merchandise, so this architecture was far more than decoration. It was propaganda carved in brick. It projected three inseparable messages: stability, piety, and success. The sheer permanence of these brick structures announced that this was not a fleeting enterprise, but a lasting order. The grandeur of the churches demonstrated that God favored their endeavors. And the overwhelming scale of it all, from the fortified walls to the wealthy homes, broadcast a simple, undeniable fact: commerce here had created a power greater than many kingdoms. To sail into Lübeck's harbor, to see that forest of gables and towers rising from the water, was to understand immediately that you were entering the capital of an invisible empire. But how did this league of merchants, for all its wealth and impressive buildings, deal with real threats, with kings and princes who coveted their success? Their brick towers proclaimed power, but the real engine of the Hanseatic League operated in hushed council chambers. With no king, no constitution, and no permanent capital, how did this sprawling network make decisions that could cripple kingdoms? The answer lies in a unique and shadowy institution, the Hanseatic. This was the League's assembly, a gathering of delegates from the member cities that met irregularly, often in Lübeck's imposing town hall. There was no fixed schedule, no permanent bureaucracy. They convened only when a crisis demanded it: a war, a pirate threat, or a foreign prince imposing unfair tolls. Picture the scene in that great hall. Delegates, each a wealthy merchant or city councillor, would arrive representing the interests of their home port, from bustling Hamburg to distant Reval. They did not come as subjects of a higher authority, but as partners in a fragile alliance. The air would have been thick with the smell of wax candles, woolen robes, and intense negotiation. These men spoke the language of ledgers and market prices, and every word was weighed against potential profit and loss. Their primary weapon was not the sword, but the trade embargo. If a foreign power, like the King of Denmark or the Count of Flanders, threatened Hans' privileges, the Hanseatic could vote to declare a Verhandlung. This was a total commercial blockade. All Hans merchants were ordered to cease trading with the offending realm. Imagine the impact. Overnight, salt would stop arriving in Bergen, Russian furs would vanish from London, and herring would rot on the Scania beaches. It was economic warfare, and for a realm dependent on Hans shipping, it could bring the economy to its knees within a single season. The process of reaching such a drastic decision, however, was agonizingly slow and built on a fragile consensus. This was not a democracy. The voices that mattered belonged to the leading cities, the Wendish Circle led by Lübeck, with Hamburg, Bremen, and a few others. Smaller towns often had little say. Debates were fierce as each city's delegate fought for his own port's advantage. Should they go to war with Denmark over control of the Sound? Should they break relations with Bruges to get better tax rates? Every conflict was a calculation. An animated sequence would show these delegates in heated debate, one pounding a table over lost silver, another calmly pointing to a map of trade routes, a third looking on with deep suspicion. Agreement was never guaranteed. The Hanseatic had no power to force a city to comply. Its authority stemmed entirely from a cold, shared understanding. To defy a collective decision was to be cast out. Exclusion from the Hanse meant losing the protection of the convoys, the privileged access to the contours, and the trust of every other merchant in the network. It was commercial death, so the League's true nature comes into sharp focus here. It was not a top-down empire, but a reactive federation of profit. It moved slowly, often reluctantly, only when a threat became so great that inaction was more costly than war. It was held together by mutual need and the profound fear of being on the outside looking in. This shadow government, meeting in secrecy, wielded a power that was all the more formidable because it was invisible, its laws written not on parchment, but in the sudden, silent emptiness of a foreign harbor. This shadow government now faced its ultimate test, not from pirates but from a crown. King Valdemar IV of Denmark looked at the wealth flowing through the narrow straits between his lands and saw not partnership but plunder. He was a warrior king intent on rebuilding a diminished Danish empire, and the Hanseatic ships were the fattest prizes on the water. His ambitions crystallized in a single, brutal act in 1361. The wealthy island of Gotland, home to the neutral trading city of Visby, was not a formal Hanse member, but its markets were vital. Valdemar's army landed and smashed the island's defenders just outside Visby's walls in a ferocious battle. He then forced the city to pay a colossal ransom and acknowledge his rule. The message was terrifyingly clear. No port in the Baltic was safe from royal ambition, and the League's cherished neutrality meant nothing to a king with a sword. Valdemar did not stop there. He began imposing exorbitant new tolls on all shipping through the Sound, the critical choke point between the North and Baltic seas. This was a direct assault on the Hanseatic lifeblood. For the first time, the slow-moving council in Lübeck had to act with military speed. They formed a war fleet, an ad hoc armada of converted merchant cogs, and allied with Valdemar's enemy, the King of Sweden. A clash came at Helsingborg in 1362. The details are sparse, but the outcome was a costly stalemate that bled both sides. The Hanse fleet was mauled, proving merchants were not natural admirals. Yet they had shown they could fight. The real lesson was not learned on the waves, but in the counting houses. Military force alone would not break the Danish king. What followed was a masterpiece of economic and political strategy. In 1367, after years of intermittent conflict and failed negotiations, the Hanseatic cities did something unprecedented. They formed the Kölner Confederation, a formal, unified military alliance. This was no longer a loose trade pact discussing an embargo. It was a war coalition with a shared treasury to fund a professional fleet and soldiers. They hired mercenaries, built specialized warships, and systematically blockaded every Danish port. They strangled the kingdom's trade completely. No grain could leave, no goods could enter. Famine and economic collapse began to grip Denmark. King Valdemar, defeated not on a battlefield but in the silent emptiness of his own harbors, was forced to flee his kingdom. The Hanseatic League sat down with the regents of a broken nation to dictate terms. The resulting Treaty of Stralsund in 1370 is one of the most astonishing documents in medieval history. Its clauses read like a fantasy for a guild of merchants. The League won the right to veto the choice of the next Danish king. They took control of key fortresses along the Sound for 15 years, effectively commanding the strait. And they were granted a massive share, 2/3, of all tolls collected from the very shipping lanes Valdemar had tried to tax. For over a decade, the Danish crown would be a financial dependent of the merchant alliance that had broken it. This was the absolute zenith of Hanseatic power. A league of city councils led by burghers and bookkeepers had not just defeated a major kingdom, they had rewritten the rules of sovereignty. They proved that in an interconnected world, credit could raise armies and trade routes could be leveraged like siege engines. The Treaty of Stralsund was a declaration that political power could flow directly from the warehouse and the ledger. It was a peak so high, however, that the only direction left to go was down. The very forces that created this victory, the relentless pursuit of monopoly and control, were already planting the seeds of the League's own slow decline. A merchant in Novgorod could know the price of wool in London before the local prince heard of a storm in the North Sea. This was the Hanseatic League's hidden nervous system, the contour. More than just trading posts, these were sovereign islands of commerce, walled compounds where German law ruled and information was the most guarded currency of all. The most famous was London Steelyard, a fortified enclave on the Thames with its own wharves, weighing house and chapel. Its high walls and guarded gate were a physical statement: we are here under our own terms. Inside, life followed a monastic rhythm of profit. Merchants lived in a communal hall, shared meals at a long table, and were forbidden from marrying English women or staying in the city beyond a set number of days. This wasn't about isolation for its own sake. It was a deliberate strategy to prevent divided loyalties and maintain a unified front in all negotiations. Every piece of gossip overheard at the London docks, every shift in the king's tax policy, every rumor of a poor harvest in France was systematically noted, discussed, and sent back to Lubeck on the next cog. The contour in Bruges operated differently, embedded in the heart of Europe's most sophisticated financial market, but its purpose was identical: intelligence gathering. Here, Hans merchants moved among Italian bankers and Flemish weavers, learning advanced credit techniques and, most crucially, discovering the secrets of English wool. They didn't just buy cloth, they learned which English counties produced the finest fleece, how the Flemish dyed it with rare pigments, and what the emerging Italian competitors were paying. This knowledge let them manipulate markets, buying up key materials to create artificial scarcity or flooding a port to drive down a rival's prices. Further north, in Bergen, Norway, the Bryggen was a wooden city within a city. Its long, narrow warehouses, called guard, stretched from the waterfront back into tight alleys. Each was owned by a different Hanse town, and they operated under a brutal, efficient hierarchy. At the top sat the senior merchants, the older men, who controlled the trade in stockfish. Below them lived the journeymen, and crammed into the attic spaces were the young apprentices, serving years of grueling service for a chance at partnership. This rigid structure ensured discipline and secrecy. An apprentice who spoke to a Norwegian about fish prices could be beaten and sent home in disgrace. The flow of information was tightly controlled, moving up the chain to be acted upon by the collective. But the most extreme example was Novgorod's Peterhof. Surrounded by a wooden palisade with a single, heavily guarded gate, it was a fortress of suspicion. Russian traders were never allowed inside. All business was conducted through a grated window. The merchants lived in utter isolation for the long trading season, under a rulebook so strict it governed the hour they could light a candle. Why such paranoia? Because the secret they protected was the source of Russia's most precious luxury, the dark, silken furs of the sable. The Hanse had exclusive access to these pelts from trappers deep in the northern forests, and knowing exactly where they came from and controlling the route to get them out was a monopoly worth more than an army. The layout of every contour served this informational purpose. The warehouse was always closest to the water for swift loading. The counting house and aldermen's chambers were centrally located, the brain of the operation. The chapel and refectory reinforced communal identity. This was a factory for data as much as for goods. A sudden drop in the price of Rhenish wine in Bruges could trigger an order to delay a shipment in Gdansk. News of a political revolt could lead to an immediate embargo. This network of outposts, all reporting back to the Hanseatic, created a real-time map of European economics that no kingdom could match. The contour system was the ultimate expression of Hanseatic power, a state within, a state whose borders were not lines on a map, but the walls of its counting houses and the silent flow of its secrets. Their walls kept secrets in, but they could not keep everything out. While the Hanseatic ledgers tracked timber and wax, something far more profound was moving along those same sea lanes, a silent exchange of culture and catastrophe. The League's ships carried more than cargo. They carried the very blueprint of a new way of life from one port to another. The most visible legacy is in the skyline, the spread of that distinctive brick Gothic architecture from Lübeck to Tallinn, from Stralsund to Gdansk. This was not a slow, organic evolution of style, it was a deliberate export. When a new city joined the Hanseatic network, it often commissioned master builders and bricklayers from Lübeck or other established centers. They brought with them the precise techniques for constructing those soaring vaults and stepped gables, literally building the identity of the League into the heart of new member towns. The style became a badge of membership, a visual declaration that this place was part of a modern, prosperous, and connected world. But the exchange went deeper than brick and mortar. Perhaps the Hanse's most powerful export was an idea, the Lübeck Law. This was a comprehensive legal code covering everything from property rights and inheritance to market regulations and criminal justice. For a new town on the Baltic coast, adopting Lübeck Law was like installing a commercial operating system. It provided a clear, predictable framework for business that was recognized and respected across the entire Hanseatic world. A merchant from Bremen could travel to Riga and understand the courts, the contracts, and his rights immediately. Over 100 cities from the Netherlands to Estonia adopted some form of this code, creating a vast zone of legal harmony that made long-distance trade not just possible but safe. This shared law was the invisible glue that held the commercial empire together, far more than any oath of allegiance. The ships also carried practical knowledge. Advanced windmill technology for grinding grain and draining land spread from the Low Countries eastward along Hanseatic routes. The art of brewing strong, hopped beer, which kept better on long voyages, migrated from German towns to Scandinavia and the Baltic, forever changing local drinking cultures. Craftsmen, artists, and even scholars found passage on merchant cogs. A painter from Bruges might be hired to decorate an altar in a Danzig church, his work blending Flemish realism with local influences. The flow was not one way. Slavic artistic motifs and construction techniques filtered back west, while the Hanseatic network became a conduit for the transmission of classical knowledge during the Renaissance, as books and ideas moved north from Italy. Yet this connected world had a terrifying dark side. The same efficient shipping lanes that moved cloth and wax also moved death. In 1347, a Genoese trading ship from the Black Sea carried the bubonic plague to Sicily. From there, the pandemic exploded along the dense web of European trade routes. The Hanseatic network, with its regular sailings between crowded ports, became a superhighway for the Black Death. A cog leaving an infected London could arrive in Bergen weeks later with a hold full of wool and a crew dying of fever. The disease ravaged the very heart of the League, killing perhaps half the population in cities like Lübeck and Hamburg. The economic and social shock was unimaginable, shattering labor markets and shaking the foundations of the medieval world. The League's greatest strength, its connectivity, had unleashed its greatest tragedy. This duality defined the Hanseatic cultural footprint. Within the walled contours, that deliberate segregation which protected commercial secrets also created isolated cultural enclaves. German merchants lived under their own laws, worshipped in their own chapels, and socialized only with each other. This isolation bred a unique, inward-looking culture of discipline and mutual trust, but it also bred deep resentment among the local populations outside the walls. In London, the men of the Steelyard were viewed with suspicion and envy. In Novgorod, they were seen as alien and arrogant. This tension was the constant background noise of Hanseatic prosperity, a reminder that the exchange of goods did not necessarily mean the exchange of goodwill. The League built bridges of commerce across the sea, but it often built walls of culture on the shore, a contradiction that would eventually contribute to its unraveling as the world around it began to change. London's Steelyard was a fortress of foreign privilege in the heart of the capital. For centuries, the Hanseatic merchants there operated under a royal charter so generous it was essentially a state within a state. The Carta Mercatoria of 1303 granted them extraordinary rights, exemption from many standard taxes, the ability to be judged by their own laws, and their own enclosed quarter on the Thames. They paid a fixed annual fee, and in return, they funneled Baltic timber, wax, and furs into England, while carrying out the vital English wool that fed the looms of Flanders. It was a sweetheart deal, and for a long time the English crown was happy to have them, as they provided goods and revenue without the trouble of building a merchant fleet. But as England recovered from plagues and wars, a new class of ambitious English merchants looked at the Steelyards' walls with deepening resentment. Why should these Germans have better trading terms in London than Englishmen themselves enjoyed in Hanseatic ports? The demand was simple and explosive: reciprocity. Tensions simmered for decades before boiling over into violence. In 1449, a fleet of over 100 Hanseatic ships, known as the Bay Fleet, was sailing from the Baltic loaded with salt and other goods. In the Channel, they were attacked by a squadron of privateers operating with vague English authorization. Several ships were captured and looted. The Hanseatic reaction was furious and immediate. They demanded compensation and the punishment of the pirates. When the English government, distracted by the internal chaos of the Wars of the Roses, responded weakly, the League deployed its ultimate weapon. They declared a trade embargo against England. Overnight, Hanseatic merchants withdrew from London and the other English ports. The impact was devastating. England's most important export, raw wool, suddenly had no buyers with ships to carry it. The vital import of Baltic timber for shipbuilding and construction ceased. The economy began to seize up. This was the brutal reality of Hanseatic power. They could strangle a kingdom's commerce without firing a single shot in anger. The conflict entered a new phase with the rise of a cunning and determined English king, Edward IV. He saw the Hanse not just as privileged traders, but as a strategic obstacle to England's own commercial ambitions. Edward began to systematically support English merchants in challenging the Hanseatic monopoly. He granted charters to English trading companies and turned a blind eye to acts of piracy against Hanse shipping. The League responded with a counter-embargo, even seizing English goods in their Baltic ports. This was a full-blown trade war, fought with ledgers and blockades. Key figures emerged in this shadow conflict, men like Hildebrand Weckenhusen, a Hanseatic merchant based in Bruges who acted as a financier, diplomat, and spy, desperately trying to hold the League's fractious cities together in a unified front against England. His surviving letters reveal a man increasingly frustrated by the slow, squabbling nature of the Hanseatic, which could not match the decisive action of a single monarch like Edward. The core of the struggle was a fundamental clash of visions. The Hanseatic League represented the old medieval model, a stateless network built on special privileges and closed trading posts. England, under Edward and his successors, embodied the emerging future, the nation-state. In this new world, economic policy was an arm of state power, designed to enrich the kingdom itself, not a foreign consortium. England began pursuing what would later be called mercantilism, policies aimed at accumulating national wealth by exporting more than it imported and building up its own shipping and industries. The Hanseatic privileges were a relic blocking this path. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1474 temporarily ended the conflict, restoring most Hanseatic rights, but the writing was on the wall. England had felt its own economic strength and seen the vulnerability of the League when faced with a determined national power. The Steelyards' walls still stood, but the world outside was changing, and the next great challenger would not come from a kingdom, but from an entirely new kind of discovery. A city within the League was trading with its enemy. While Hanseatic ships blockaded English ports in the 1470s, merchants from Cologne continued to send their Rhenish wine and metal goods directly to London. This was not a minor violation, it was a betrayal of the collective will, and it exposed the fatal crack running through the heart of the alliance. The Hanseatic League was never a monolith. It was a tense coalition of regional blocs with competing interests. On one side were the Wendish cities led by Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen. Their power and identity were built on the sea, on the Baltic timber trade, the herring fisheries, and the eastern routes to Novgorod. Their prosperity flowed with the saltwater currents. On the other side were the Westphalian and Prussian cities, with Cologne as their powerful champion. These inland cities were oriented toward the river systems of the Rhine and the lucrative overland trade routes connecting to southern Europe. For Cologne, England was not a distant adversary, it was a critical, long-standing partner. To cut off that trade to support Lübeck's maritime quarrel was an economic suicide they were unwilling to commit. The stage was set for a civil war conducted in council chambers. Picture the scene at a Hanseatic called to address this crisis. The air in Lübeck's hall is thick with accusation. The delegate from Lübeck, face flushed with anger, might slam a ledger on the table, pointing to records proving Cologne's ships had docked in London during the embargo. "Our wealth is built on unity," he would shout. "When one city breaks faith, it weakens us all." The Cologne delegate would stand calm and defiant. "You speak of unity, but you ask us to beggar our people for a fight that is not ours. Your war with England is a war for control of the sea. Our lifeblood is the river. We will not starve for your principles." These debates were not just about policy, they were about identity. The coastal cities saw the League as a maritime shield, a collective navy and trading bloc. The inland cities saw it as a protective guild, a provider of trading privileges and legal security. When those core perceptions clashed, compromise became almost impossible. The crisis culminated in 1476. After years of failed warnings and mounting fury from the Wendish faction, the Hanseatic took the drastic, almost unthinkable step. They formally expelled the mighty city of Cologne from the League. Imagine the shockwave this sent through every merchant house from Gdansk to Dortmund. Cologne was not some minor outpost, it was one of the founding pillars of German commerce, a city of immense wealth and influence. Its expulsion was like a body amputating its own arm. It was a declaration that the principle of collective action was more important than any single member, no matter how powerful, but it was also a confession of profound weakness. The League had no police, no soldiers to enforce its will on a defiant city. Its only real power was the threat of exclusion, and now it had to prove that threat was worse than going it alone. For Cologne, the years of exile were difficult but not fatal. It leveraged its independent ties with England and the Rhineland, proving it could survive outside the fold. For the League, the schism was a disaster. It revealed to every foreign king and competitor that the Hanseatic alliance was fracturing from within. The expulsion was eventually reversed in 1479, with Cologne readmitted after making vague promises, but the damage was permanent. The precedent was set: a major city could defy the collective, suffer a temporary punishment, and return on its own terms. The sacred principle of unity had been negotiable. This internal rift highlighted the League's core architectural flaw. It was a system built for mutual profit in a stable world, not for strategic sacrifice in a changing one. It could agree on how to split the proceeds from a herring catch, but it could not forge a unified foreign policy when the interests of its members fundamentally diverged. The slow, consensus-based Hanseatic was paralyzed by regional self-interest. While they debated, the new nation-states of England, the Netherlands, and a unified Denmark were making swift, decisive decisions. They were building their own merchant fleets, granting monopolies to their own national companies, and viewing the Hanseatic privileges not as beneficial treaties, but as obstacles to their sovereignty. The League's greatest strength had always been its network, the trust that a merchant in Bruges could rely on a partner in Riga. Now that network was fraying as the threads of local interest proved stronger than the weave of collective purpose. The invisible empire was becoming visible, and what others saw was not a giant, but a gathering of squabbling towns, each looking out for its own harbor as the tide of history began to turn. The League's internal squabbles were a luxury it could no longer afford. While the delegates from Lübeck and Cologne argued over principle, a new kind of ship began to appear in the Baltic, a vessel that made the Hanseatic cog look like a relic from a bygone age. This was the Fluit or Flight, and it was the herald of a mercantile revolution sailing under the Dutch flag. Its design was a stroke of brutal efficiency. Where the cog was rounded and tall-sided, built to carry cargo and defend itself, the Flight was long, lean, and almost bulbous below the waterline. Its genius was in its simplicity. It had a flat bottom like the cog, but its sides sloped inward to a narrow deck. This clever shape meant it avoided the heavy tolls levied at Danish sound dues, which were calculated based on a ship's deck width. More cargo could be crammed into its hull, yet it required a skeleton crew, sometimes just a dozen men where a cog needed 30. The Flight was not a warship pretending to be a trader. It was a pure, dedicated cargo container, and it slashed the cost of moving goods across the sea. The Dutch did not just bring better ships, they brought a completely different commercial philosophy. The Hanseatic system was built on control, exclusion, and privilege. Access to markets was guarded by the fortified contours and the complex web of guild regulations that dictated who could trade what and for how much. The Dutch offered something dangerously simple: open competition and better prices. They sailed directly to the source, bypassing the Hanseatic middlemen entirely. A Dutch captain would pull into a Baltic port like Riga or Danzig, offer to buy timber or grain at a slightly higher price than the Hanseatic merchant, and sell his salt or cloth at a slightly lower one. He had no expensive compound to maintain, no aldermen to answer to, and his low operating costs meant he could still turn a profit. For local producers and foreign buyers alike, the appeal was irresistible. Why sell exclusively to the Hanseatic contour when a Dutchman would pay more tomorrow? This was a classic case of disruptive innovation, and the Hanseatic League, blinded by centuries of dominance, failed to see the threat until it was too late. Their response was not adaptation, but entrenchment. They doubled down on their old privileges, petitioning kings and princes to exclude the Dutch to enforce their monopolies. They clung to their beloved cogs, dismissing the Flight as flimsy and unsafe. In their council halls, they debated legalities and historical rights while the Dutch were rewriting the rules of commerce on the water. The League's very success had bred a fatal complacency. Their system was a magnificent machine for preserving a profitable status quo, but it was agonizingly slow to innovate. The guilds that ensured quality and collective action also stifled individual initiative and rapid change. A young Hanseatic merchant with a new idea had to convince a council of his elders, while a young Dutch captain needed only a willing backer and a clear horizon. The contrast could not have been starker. On one side, a rigid, guild-controlled network struggling to maintain its walled gardens of trade. On the other, a nimble, decentralized swarm of independent entrepreneurs connected by market signals and sailing the most efficient ships in the world. The Dutch did not need to defeat the Hanseatic League in battle or get expelled from its contours. They simply made the League's entire, intricate system look expensive, slow, and unnecessary. The Hanseatic blind spot was its own past glory. It kept looking backward to defend its privileges while the future was sailing right past it, loaded with cheaper goods and heading for open markets. This shift in the winds of trade was irreversible, and it left the great commercial alliance looking increasingly like a grand but outdated fortress, its walls still imposing, but its gates no longer controlling the flow of the world. The resentment simmering in every contour finally boiled over into violence in the cold, wet spring of 1523. The target was the Hanseatic enclave in Bergen, Norway, the Briggen, a sprawling wooden fortress of commerce that had dominated the stockfish trade for centuries. For generations, the German merchants there had lived under their own laws, a privileged elite looking down on the Norwegian city that surrounded them. Their world was a strict hierarchy. At the top sat the aldermen, the senior merchants who controlled the trade and lived in relative comfort. Below them toiled the journeymen, and crammed into the damp attic spaces were the young German apprentices, boys sent from home to serve years of grueling, often abusive labor with the promise of future partnership. Their lives were a misery of menial tasks, harsh discipline, and meager rations, all within sight of the immense wealth their work generated. The spark came from within the walls. The apprentices, desperate and furious, finally revolted against their masters. They broke into the merchants' storerooms, seizing food and drink. But this internal mutiny quickly spilled into the streets of Bergen, where it ignited the long-held fury of the Norwegian citizens themselves. Shopkeepers, fishermen, and laborers who had watched the Hanseatic community operate as a state within their state saw their chance. The uprising exploded. A mob of Norwegian citizens joined the rebellious apprentices, and together they turned on the brigand. They stormed the compound, not to loot in the traditional sense, but to dismantle the symbol of their oppression. They attacked the merchant houses, smashed the meticulously kept ledgers that recorded their economic subjugation, and drove the terrified aldermen into hiding. For a few chaotic days, the fortress of commerce was breached, its inviolable law replaced by the roar of the crowd. The Hanseatic League, of course, struck back. They called upon their remaining allies, and with the support of the Danish crown, which still ruled Norway, they brutally suppressed the uprising. The ringleaders were executed, order was restored, and the aldermen returned to their counting houses. On the surface, it was a victory. The Hanse had reclaimed its property and reasserted its control. But the siege of Bergen was a profound symbolic defeat, one that echoed far louder than any military surrender. The walls had not been broken by a foreign army, but by the very people who lived outside them, and even by the exploited youth within. It revealed the deep, festering social tension that the League's insular privilege had created everywhere. The event sent a chilling message to every other contour from London to Novgorod. The local population was no longer a passive backdrop for Hanseatic business. They were a potential enemy, and they now knew the merchants' fortresses were not impregnable. More importantly, it marked a critical shift in political reality. The Danish authorities, who helped crush the revolt, did not do it out of loyalty to the Hanse. They did it to restore their own royal order. In the aftermath, they began to insist on greater oversight. The idea that the brigand was a sovereign German territory, a law unto itself, was irrevocably broken. Local and royal power began to encroach on Hanseatic autonomy, demanding a say in justice and governance within the compound. The siege proved that the League's power ultimately rested on the consent, however grudging, of the kingdoms that hosted it. When that consent turned to open hostility, even the thickest wooden walls and the strictest guild rules could not protect them. The crack in the fortress mentality had appeared, and through it, the changing tides of a new era began to flood in. The world was suddenly much larger than the Baltic Sea. While Hanseatic cogs made their predictable circuits between Lübeck and Novgorod, Portuguese carracks were rounding the Cape of Good Hope, and Spanish galleons were crossing the Atlantic. The Age of Discovery did not just map new continents, it remapped the entire global economy. The most coveted goods were no longer Baltic timber or Russian furs, but Indian spices, Chinese silks, and American silver. Europe's economic heart began beating in Lisbon, Seville, and later Amsterdam, leaving the northern inland sea feeling like a provincial backwater. The Hanseatic League, master of the regional bulk trade, had no part in this new global drama. Their ships were not built for ocean voyages, their capital was tied up in traditional networks, and their collective councils moved far too slowly to seize such distant, risky opportunities. They were masters of a pond just as others began sailing oceans, yet a more immediate and devastating collapse was happening much closer to home in the east. For centuries, the Peterhof in Novgorod had been the League's gateway to the vast wealth of Russia, the source of precious wax, honey, and most importantly, those dark, luxurious sable furs. But Novgorod's days as an independent merchant republic were numbered. A new power was rising in Moscow, led by a grand prince named Ivan III. He was building a centralized Russian state, and he saw the Hanseatic enclave not as a valuable partner, but as a foreign tumor on his sovereign territory. The German merchants, with their insular laws and refusal to integrate, were an affront to his authority. In 1494, after a series of disputes and diplomatic insults, Ivan made his move. He ordered the Peterhof closed, his soldiers sealed the gates of the compound, expelled the merchants, and confiscated their warehouses full of goods. The ancient trade route was severed with the slam of a door. For the Hanse, this was an economic catastrophe. Their monopoly on the Russian trade, a cornerstone of their wealth for 300 years, vanished overnight. There were no convoys to send, no embargo to declare against a land power as vast and indifferent as Muscovy. Ivan had simply drawn a border, and the stateless League could not cross it. This pattern repeated across the Baltic. To the north, the Swedish kingdom was consolidating into an empire, aggressively expanding its control over the eastern shores of the sea. They seized territories and ports that had once operated under the loose commercial umbrella of the Hanse, imposing their own taxes and regulations. The League's influence in cities like Stockholm and Riga withered under the shadow of the Swedish crown. Most crucially, the Danish monarchy, humbled a century earlier by the Treaty of Stralsund, had regained its strength. One by one, they reclaimed the fortresses that commanded the Sound, the narrow strait between Denmark and Sweden that was the Baltic's front door. With those fortresses came back the tolls. The Danish king once again controlled the choke point, and he steadily raised the Sound dues, taxing every ship that passed, Hanseatic or not. The League's treasured exemption was a memory. They could no longer veto a Danish king or claim a share of the revenue. They were just another group of merchants paying a toll to a sovereign state. An animated map of this era tells the grim story. As vibrant new lines stretch across the globe to the Americas and Asia, the dense, familiar web of Hanseatic routes in northern Europe begins to flicker and fade. The bright dot of Novgorod goes dark, the lines to Bergen and London grow faint. The Sound, once a Hanseatic lake, is now marked by the unmistakable stamp of the Danish crown. The map of commerce was being redrawn in the bold, solid colors of nation-states, and the Hanseatic League, a network of dotted lines and handshake agreements, was being erased. Its greatest weakness was now fatal. It was a power without a territory, trying to negotiate with powers for whom territory was the very definition of sovereignty. The world of privileges was over, replaced by a world of passports, tariffs, and national flags. The final blow was not a declaration of war, but a simple failure to convene. For over 300 years, the Hanseatic had been the beating heart of the League, the gathering where crises were met and collective will was forged. But by the 17th century, the summons went out less and less frequently. The problems were no longer shared pirate threats or embargoes against kings. They were local, complex issues of religious strife and national allegiance. Why should a merchant from Protestant Hamburg risk a dangerous journey to debate policies with a delegate from Catholic Cologne when their worlds were pulling violently apart? The last official assembly was called in 1669. Of the hundreds of towns once enmeshed in the network, only 9 sent representatives to Lübeck's town hall. The Great Hall, built for the clamor of a commercial empire, echoed with the whispers of a dying institution. They met, they talked, and they adjourned with no grand pronouncements. The Hanseatic simply never met again. It was an administrative whimper, the final, quiet acknowledgement that the common cause had evaporated. The real dissolution happened not in a council chamber, but in 1,000 separate decisions made in city halls across northern Europe. Piece by piece, the network unraveled as member cities cut their own deals. Cologne, after its earlier expulsion and readmission, had long since oriented itself firmly toward the Rhineland and its French connections. Bremen and Hamburg, as free imperial cities, began negotiating directly with the rising power of Sweden and the Dutch Republic, securing their own port privileges to survive in the new mercantile world. They chose practical survival over nostalgic loyalty to a fading idea. The most brutal catalyst for this final unraveling was the 30 Years' War, a continent-shattering conflict that raged from 1618 to 1648. This was not a war over trade routes, but over religion and dynastic power, and it turned the German heartlands into a charnel house. Armies marched back and forth, laying waste to the countryside, besieging cities, and wiping out a third of the population in some regions. The intricate web of roads, rivers, and trust that underpinned overland Hanseatic trade was shredded. A merchant's primary concern was no longer profit, but simple survival. The war finalized the League's irrelevance, proving that in the age of the nation-state, only sovereign powers with standing armies could hope to provide security. Commerce now followed the flag, not the other way around, so what remained when the power was gone, the structure, like a ghost, lingered. While the Hanseatic League dissolved, smaller regional alliances persisted out of habit and local necessity. The Wendish Circle, a grouping of cities around Lübeck, continued to meet occasionally to discuss matters of local shipping and law. But the most fascinating legacy was in a title. 3 cities, Hamburg, Bremen, and Lübeck, clung tenaciously to the designation, Free and Hanseatic City. This was no longer a claim to a trading network, but a legal and political status within the chaotic patchwork of the German land. It signified their historic independence from local princes, their right to self-government, and their direct allegiance only to the distant Holy Roman Emperor. They were city-states, living fossils of a medieval world order. When the German Empire unified in 1871, Hamburg and Bremen-Lübeck had lost its status by then entered not as mere provinces, but as distinct states, negotiating to keep their ancient harbors as exclusive customs zones. The name Hanseatic had been hollowed out of its original meaning, a convoy of mutual protection, and repurposed as a badge of civic pride and historical exceptionalism. The empire of contracts was gone, but the letterhead astonishingly remained. The last Hanseatic adjourned into silence, but the true record of the League's life was supposed to be eternal, locked away in the vaults of Lübeck's city archive. That building, a fortress of parchment and vellum, held the collective memory of an invisible empire. Within its climate-controlled rooms rested the original minutes of the Hanseatic debates, the private correspondence between merchants, the meticulous ledgers documenting every barrel of herring and every sable pelt. This was not just a library, it was the League's brain, preserved in ink. Then, on the night of March 28, 1942, the air raid sirens wailed over Lübeck. British bombers targeted the historic city centre, and a firestorm engulfed the streets. The archive, for all its treasures, was not spared. Floors of wooden shelving and centuries of dry paper became fuel for an unimaginable blaze. Historians and firefighters could only watch as a millennium of records turned to ash and floating embers. The physical heart of the Hanseatic League was incinerated in a single night of modern warfare. The scale of the loss is almost incomprehensible. Think of it as the burning of a vast, intricate diary. Not just the major events were lost, but the mundane details that reveal how a society truly functioned. We lost the day-to-day account books that would show how a merchant in Bergen actually priced his stockfish, the personal letters complaining about a lazy apprentice or a dishonest partner, the drafts of treaties showing the heated edits and compromises. What secrets turned to smoke? Perhaps there were records of secret agreements with kings that never entered the official histories. Maybe there were detailed maps of unknown trade routes or lists of members so extensive they would have revealed the League as far larger than we now believe. The financial records alone, if they had survived, could have told us the exact scale of Hanseatic wealth, allowing us to calculate its economic power compared to entire kingdoms. That knowledge is gone forever. The bombing did not just destroy documents, it erased the granular truth of how this stateless entity operated, leaving behind only its grand brick shell monuments and the echoes of its power. This catastrophic loss is why the Hanseatic League remains, in many ways, a permanent historical mystery. We are forced to reconstruct a ghost from its scattered footprints. Historians now work like detectives, piecing together the story from fragments that survived outside the Lübeck Inferno. A copy of a trade agreement might be found in a municipal archive in Tallinn. A letter complaining about Hamburg's ships could turn up in a private collection in Bruges. The records of the London steelyard, seized by English authorities centuries ago, provide one fractured perspective. The archives of the Danish crown, detailing the sound dues, offer another. The picture we have is a mosaic where most of the tiles are missing, assembled from the edges inward. This patchwork evidence forces a reliance on inference and guesswork. We know the League was powerful because cities built immense churches to celebrate its wealth, but we can only estimate how that wealth was distributed among its members. We know it defeated Denmark, but the backroom deals that made the coalition hold are largely opaque. The loss of the core archive means the Hanse's inner workings, its daily rhythms and quiet crises, are shrouded in a silence deeper than the Baltic fog. Yet the quest to rebuild this lost memory continues in the digital age. An international effort, a kind of scholarly Hanseatic, is underway. Historians and archivists from across Europe are collaborating on digital reconstruction projects. They are scanning every surviving document related to the League from hundreds of different repositories from Gdansk to London. The goal is to create a virtual archive, reuniting these scattered fragments in a single, searchable database. Advanced imaging technology can sometimes rid the ghost impressions left on parchments used in later bindings or decipher faded ink. It is slow, painstaking work, a line of code and a scanned page at a time. Each recovered fragment is a clue. A single ledger entry from Riga might confirm a trade route we only suspected. A merchant's will discovered in Stralsund could reveal the network of family ties that bound the commerce together. This digital archaeology will never replace what was lost, but it is weaving a new, fragile net to catch glimpses of the truth. It ensures that the League's story, though permanently incomplete, will not be forgotten, and that every new discovery can find its place in the puzzle, helping the ghost of the Hanse to slowly, gradually take a clearer shape. The seafloor is a frozen museum of Hanseatic trade. While the Lübeck archive burned, another kind of record lay perfectly preserved in the cold, dark silt of riverbeds and harbors, waiting for centuries to be found. These are the sunken cogs, the lost ships of the League, and they are primary sources that speak from the depths in a way no charred parchment ever could. The most famous of these ghost ships is the Bremen cog, discovered in 1962 during dredging work on the Weser River. Imagine the moment of recognition. Workers pulled up waterlogged, blackened timbers, expecting debris, but archaeologists saw the distinct shape emerging from the mud, the flat bottom, the overlapping clinker-built planks, the entire skeleton of a merchant vessel from 1380. It was a time capsule, sealed the day it sank. The ship was so intact that we could see the carpenter's marks, the Roman numerals carved into the frames to guide assembly, like medieval IKEA instructions. We could study the caulking, the moss and animal hair hammered between the planks to make it watertight. This wasn't a model or a drawing, it was the real thing, a working machine of commerce pulled from its grave. Inside this wooden tomb, the personal stories of the crew materialized. Among the silt were simple leather shoes, a wooden bowl with the spoon still resting inside, and a small barrel that once held the crew's drinking water. These weren't treasures for kings, they were the humble possessions of working men. a poignant reminder that this empire of contracts was built by individuals who ate, slept, and feared the storm on this very deck. Then there was the cargo. The hold contained barrels of quicklime, a building material, but also more intimate finds like a folding wooden altar for the ship's private prayers and a pair of wrought iron dividers, the tool of a navigator or a merchant for measuring distances on a chart. Each object is a sentence in a story the written records never tell, the story of faith and calculation that sailed together on every voyage. Another remarkable wreck, the Dole cog found in a polder near Antwerp, revealed a different snapshot. This ship from the early 1300s was carrying a cargo of building stone, but its true gift to history was its construction. Tree ring analysis or dendrochronology performed on its oak timbers is like reading the ship's genetic code. Scientists can match the pattern of the tree's growth rings to master chronologies for European oak. The analysis on the Dole cog showed its planks were cut from trees felled in the winter of 1325 to 1326, and those trees had grown in the region of northwest Germany, likely near the Rhine. This single scientific fact opens a window into the Hanseatic logistical network. It tells us they were sourcing quality timber from specific managed forests, transporting it to a shipyard, perhaps in Cologne or Dordrecht, and constructing a vessel to carry stone downriver. The ship itself is a map of its own supply chain. Every new wreck adds a crucial piece to the puzzle. The discovery of the copper wreck off the coast of Sweden, laden with thousands of copper plates, speaks to the bulk metal trade with the Baltic. A wreck found in the Bay of Gdansk, still packed with barrels of iron ore, confirms the routes for raw materials feeding Europe's forges. Maritime archaeology allows us to see what was actually in the hold, not just what was declared on a manifest. It shows repairs made with different wood, hinting at a ship's long life and far-flung ports of call. It reveals how the cog design evolved over time, getting larger and more specialized. These silent wrecks correct the historical record. They show us that alongside the official cargo of timber and herring, ships carried personal goods for trade or gifts, like the distinctive Baltic amber or the sharpening stones found on many wrecks, essential for maintaining tools on a long journey. So while fire stole the League's paperwork, water saved its hardware. Each carefully excavated cog is a chapter recovered from the seabed, written in wood, iron, and stone. They tell us about the shipwright's skill, the sailor's daily life, and the physical reality of trade in a way no council minute ever could. They are the tangible, waterlogged proof of the network that once was, and they continue to surface, offering new answers and posing new questions with every tide. A merchant's most valuable cargo was not in the hold, but in his sealed letter case. Across the vast and dangerous distances of the Hanseatic world, information was the ultimate currency, and protecting it was a matter of commercial life and death. How did the League, a decentralized network of fiercely competitive cities, coordinate embargoes against kings or negotiate secret trade deals without their plans being intercepted by rivals or spies? The answer lies in a shadowy realm of ink and ingenuity, the world of medieval cryptography. While the Lübeck fire destroyed the central evidence, fragments of their secret communications have survived in scattered archives, offering tantalizing glimpses into a sophisticated intelligence network. We have letters between contours, their crucial passages transformed into baffling sequences of symbols or odd words. These were not complex machines like the later Enigma, but clever, handcrafted ciphers built for practicality. The most common was likely the simple substitution cipher, where each letter of the alphabet is replaced by another according to a fixed key. Imagine a letter where the word herring appears as kulch. To an outsider, it's gibberish. To a merchant in Bruges with the correct cipher wheel or a memorized alphabet shift, it reads as clearly as a market price. But for more sensitive matters, they probably used something stronger, a nomenclator. This was a codebook, a list where specific words or names were replaced by pre-agreed code groups. In a nomenclature, the King of Denmark might become the fox, an embargo could be a north wind, and Lübeck might be the old oak. A single sentence like Lübeck urges an embargo against the King of Denmark would be sent as a seemingly innocent phrase about weather and wildlife. The old oak fears a north wind from the fox. To anyone without the codebook, the message was perfectly opaque, a discussion of pastoral concerns. To the recipient with the matching list, it was a crystal clear directive. The logistical challenges were immense. How did you manage these secret keys across thousands of miles? Codebooks and cipher wheels had to be painstakingly copied by hand and distributed by trusted couriers aboard the very cogs that carried the goods. If a ship was lost or a contour raided, the entire system could be compromised, requiring a frantic and risky reset of all codes. This suggests an astonishing level of organized secrecy for a supposedly loose alliance. The need for such encryption reveals the high-stakes game they were playing. When the Hanseatic voted to declare a Verhanstung, a total trade embargo against England or Flanders, that decision had to be communicated instantly and covertly to every contour and major merchant house. If a rival Dutch trader or an English spy learned of the embargo a week early, they could buy up all available stock and wreck the plan. Similarly, negotiations with a prince for lower tolls required absolute discretion, lest competing Hanse cities get wind of the deal and undercut it. Their coded letters were the nervous system of their collective power, allowing them to act as one entity despite their internal fractures. The haunting question is one of scale. Were these codes standardized across the entire league, or did each city or contour have its own private system? The evidence is too fragmentary to say. A coded letter from the Steelyard in London to its home office in Cologne might use a different cipher than one sent from Riga to Lübeck. This very fragmentation may have been a security feature, compartmentalizing information. Yet it also highlights the central mystery. Without a surviving master archive, we are left with disconnected fragments of a vast, silent conversation. We have the locked boxes, but most of the keys are at the bottom of the sea, lost in shipwrecks or turned to ash. This hidden world of coded communication forces us to reconsider the Hanseatic League. It was not merely a trade guild, it operated a pre-modern business intelligence network, where encrypted dispatches moved faster than royal couriers, where market forecasts and political threats were analyzed in locked counting houses. Their real capital was not just silver but secrets, and they protected that capital with a sophistication that rivals any modern corporation. A merchant ship flying the Hanseatic flag could be a vessel of commerce one day and a raider the next. This was the dangerous reality of the northern seas, where the line between legal trade and outright piracy was often a matter of perspective and political convenience. To understand this shadowy world, we must meet its most legendary figure, Klaus Störtebeker. According to Hamburg's official records, he was a ruthless pirate captain, a menace to all lawful shipping, who was finally captured and executed in 1401. The chronicles say he was beheaded on the Grasbrook sandbank before the city gates, a public spectacle to warn others. But the legend that grew around him tells a very different story. In folk tales, Störtebeker became a Baltic Robin Hood, a rebel who robbed from the rich Hanseatic merchants to give to the poor. He was said to have magical powers, and after his execution, his headless body allegedly stood up and walked past 11 of his crewmen before finally collapsing, a sign of his superhuman defiance. The truth, as always, lies buried somewhere in the silt between the official record and the popular myth. Störtebeker was likely a privateer, a sailor licensed by one power to attack the ships of its enemies. In an era of constant petty wars between Scandinavian kingdoms and northern duchies, such letters of marque were common. A merchant with a fast ship and a brave crew could easily cross the line from sanctioned privateering to unsanctioned piracy, especially when a war ended and the license to plunder was suddenly revoked. Did Störtebeker specifically target Hanseatic ships? Almost certainly, But was he an enemy of the League itself, or merely a predator operating in its waters? The League's reaction is telling. They hunted him down not as a common criminal, but as a direct threat to their economic stability. His execution was a necessary piece of political theater for Hamburg, demonstrating the city's power to keep the sea lanes safe for commerce. Yet, the persistence of his legend as a folk hero suggests a deep public ambivalence, a sense that the wealthy merchants of the Hanse were not always the benevolent guardians they claimed to be. This ambiguity leads us to a more organized and formidable threat, the Victual Brothers. They began not as pirates, but as privateers in the service of the Swedish crown during its war against Denmark in the 1390s. Their name comes from the Latin vitalia, meaning provisions, because their initial mission was to run the Danish blockade and supply the besieged Swedish fortress of Stockholm. They were state-sanctioned, their violence given a legal veneer. But when the war ended, the Victual Brothers did not simply disband. They had tasted the profits of plunder and built a powerful fleet. They became a law unto themselves, a floating brotherhood that answered to no king or council. They seized the island of Gotland with its strategic port of Visby as their fortified base. From there, they commanded the Baltic, attacking ships of all nations, including, and perhaps especially, the fat merchant cogs of the Hanseatic League. For the League, the Victual Brothers represented an existential crisis. They were not a foreign kingdom that could be embargoed or negotiated with. They were a hydra with many heads, a decentralized network of violence that mirrored the Hanse's own decentralized network of trade. The Hanseatic debated, raised funds, and sent fleets against them, but eradicating them proved incredibly difficult. They would scatter to hidden coves or find temporary protection from a local noble who took a share of their loot. This raises a provocative and dark theory. In the cutthroat competition of medieval trade, was some piracy tacitly encouraged? Could a Hanseatic city council, frustrated by a Dutch competitor undercutting their prices, quietly look the other way if a known pirate like Sturtebeker began targeting that competitor's ships? It is a charge impossible to prove from surviving documents, but it fits the ruthless logic of the time. In a world of weak central authority, where the Hanse itself operated in a legal gray zone, using deniable assets to harass rivals would be a brutal, effective strategy. The relationship was likely symbiotic and ever-shifting. A pirate might sell his plundered goods at a discount in a Hanseatic port that asked no questions. A city might hire a former privateer to captain a defensive patrol. The Victual Brothers themselves, for a time, even held letters of marque from multiple warring factions simultaneously, making them simultaneously legal and outlaw depending on who you ask. Maps of their bases tell this story of fluid allegiance, dotted not just on remote islands, but near the mouths of rivers controlled by sympathetic local lords. The Hanseatic League, an empire built on contracts, ultimately had to confront the chaos it helped to breed. Their final victory over the Victual Brothers came not through naval brilliance, but through the slow, grinding pressure of economic and political isolation, backed by military force. The Order of the Teutonic Knights, a military religious order and sometimes Hanseatic ally, finally stormed the pirate stronghold on Gotland in 1398. The age of the great pirate brotherhoods ended, but the temptation never died. The blurry line between merchant and pirate remained, a permanent feature of a world where the sea was a lawless space and a loaded ship was a floating fortune waiting to be claimed. This murky relationship forces us to ask who, in the end, were the true masters of the Baltic, the merchants in their brick town halls, or the adventurers who ruled the waves by sword and sail. Even the League's membership list is a phantom document. If you search for a definitive roster of Hanseatic cities, you will find numbers that range wildly from 70 to well over 200. This isn't a case of lost records, it's a reflection of the League's very essence. There was never an official application to join or a central registry of members. A city was considered part of the Hanse if it acted like it, a de facto membership based on behavior and benefit. The three key criteria were participation, compliance, and protection. Did a city's merchants regularly send delegates to the Hanseatic? Did they generally abide by the collective decisions like embargoes? And crucially, did they enjoy the privileges and protections the League negotiated, such as reduced tolls in foreign ports or the safety of the convoys? If the answer was yes, then for all practical purposes, they were in. This created a constantly shifting constellation of affiliation. Picture a dynamic map of Northern Europe over 3 centuries. A few bright, steady stars burn continuously, the core Wendish cities like Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen. Around them, other points of light flicker with varying intensity. A port like Gdansk or Riga might glow brightly for centuries, deeply integrated into the trade network. But then watch a city like Cologne, its light dimming dramatically during its expulsion in the 1470s before flaring back to life. Elsewhere, you see brief, sporadic flashes. A town like Dinant, in modern-day Belgium famous for its metalwork, might have sent delegates to a single Hanseatic to argue for its interests on a specific trade issue, enjoying the League's protections for that moment before fading back into a purely local focus. Was Dinant a member for that brief period? Functionally, yes. For the decades before and after, no. This ambiguity extends to major trading centers that had deep commercial ties with the Hanse but maintained a fierce political independence. Take Krakow, the magnificent capital of the Polish kingdom. Hanseatic merchants were a constant presence there, and Krakow's trade was vital to the network, especially for goods moving south into Hungary and beyond. Yet Krakow never submitted to Hanseatic law or sent obedient delegates to Lübeck. It was a powerful partner, a critical node in the system, but not a member in the sense that Lübeck was. The same could be said for places like Bruges or London, hosts to major contours. They were the destinations, the markets, the places where Hanseatic power was exercised, but they themselves were never part of the alliance. This fluidity is the ultimate expression of the League's network-based power. It was not a club with a membership card, it was a gravitational field. Cities orbited its center of economic gravity based on their own needs. When a conflict with Denmark threatened all Baltic shipping, dozens of towns would suddenly align, their lights on the map glowing in unison. When the crisis passed and local interests like a separate peace with a neighbor or a dispute over river tolls took precedence, that alignment would weaken. Some cities might only engage with the Hanse for a single commodity, like a Norwegian town solely concerned with the stockfish trade through Bergen. This is why pinning down the League's true size and influence is so maddeningly difficult for historians. You cannot count the members of an idea. You can only map the patterns of its influence, a shimmering, ever-changing web of commerce and mutual interest that defies a simple list. The ghost members are not an error in the record. They are the record proof that the Hanseatic League was less an organization and more a phenomenon, a force of economic nature that cities could flow into and out of as easily as the tide. Their ships carried more than cargo, they carried the very architecture of our modern economy. While kings ruled by divine right, the Hanseatic merchants were quietly inventing the tools of global finance in their waterfront counting houses. Their greatest legacy is not in the brick they left behind, but in the invisible systems they engineered to make trust possible across a dangerous and distrustful world. Consider the fundamental problem of moving wealth itself. A merchant sending a shipment of furs from Novgorod to Bruges could not possibly send the equivalent value in heavy silver coins, a tempting target for every bandit and pirate along the way. The solution was a revolutionary piece of paper, the bill of exchange. This was an early form of a check. A merchant in Novgorod would deposit his silver with a local Hanseatic money changer. In return, he received a letter of credit, a promise of payment made out to his agent in Bruges. That agent could then present the letter to the Hanseatic money changer in Bruges and receive the funds in local currency. No bulky coins ever crossed the continent. This system, which we now call double-entry bookkeeping on a continental scale, allowed capital to flow with the speed of a sailing ship and the security of a sealed letter. It was the nervous system of their commercial empire, and it laid the groundwork for modern international banking. Then there was the ever-present specter of disaster. A storm could send a cog and its entire fortune to the bottom of the North Sea in an hour. To prevent a single shipwreck from bankrupting a merchant, they pioneered the concept of maritime insurance. Risk was pooled. A group of merchants would each contribute a small premium into a shared fund. If one of their ships was lost, the fund would cover a portion of the loss, allowing the merchant to survive and trade again. This was not charity, it was cold, brilliant mathematics, spreading catastrophe across many shoulders so that no one carrier was crushed by it. It transformed trade from a desperate gamble into a calculated risk, encouraging more investment and more voyages. The League also mastered the art of remote production and quality control, a system later called the Verlag system. A Hanseatic merchant in Cologne would not simply buy finished cloth from a Flemish weaver. He would provide the raw English wool upfront, along with a detailed specification for the type, color, and weave required. He was essentially outsourcing the labor while controlling the supply chain and the final product. This required and enforced rigorous standards. Hanseatic inspectors, known as Schauer, had the authority to examine goods at any point. A bolt of cloth that was too short or dyed with inferior pigment would be seized and burned in the public square, and the offending producer blacklisted. The same strictness applied to beer, the lifeblood of every voyage. Brewing standards in cities like Hamburg were codified into law. The famous Reinheitsgebot that dictated only barley, hops, and water could be used, ensuring a consistent, preservable product. This obsessive focus on quality built the Hanseatic brand. A merchant in Gdansk could buy a barrel of Hamburg beer or a length of Flemish cloth sight unseen, trusting it would match exactly what was ordered. That trust was the true currency of their network. Perhaps their most profound legal innovation was the concept of extraterritoriality, practiced in their contours. These trading posts operated under Hanseatic law, not local law. This meant a merchant from Lübeck doing business in London or Novgorod was judged by his peers under commercial statutes he understood, not by a potentially hostile or arbitrary foreign court. It created islands of predictable justice which encouraged investment and long-term planning. Over decades, these disparate local practices coalesced into a common body of commercial law, a forerunner to modern international trade law. It addressed contracts, debt collection, partnership disputes, and liability, all with the central goal of facilitating commerce and resolving conflicts efficiently. The Hanseatic League did not just move goods, it built the operating system for a complex market. They proved that trust could be institutionalized through letters of credit, that risk could be managed through collective insurance, and that quality could be guaranteed through enforceable standards. When the Dutch and English later formed their giant East India companies, they were not starting from scratch. They were plugging into a pre-existing framework, scaling up the financial and legal tools that Hanseatic merchants had spent centuries refining in the cold waters of the Baltic. Their invisible empire of contracts ultimately proved more durable than any castle, because its blueprints became the foundation for the world we live in today. The ghost of the Hanseatic League did not vanish, it simply found a new body. Centuries after the last Hanse attack, the core idea of independent entities banding together for mutual economic gain resurfaced on a continental scale. The European Union, at its heart, is a startling echo of that medieval alliance. It is not a single European super-state, but a coalition of sovereign nations that have voluntarily pooled aspects of their sovereignty to create something greater, a common market with standardized rules, just as the Hanseatic cities once did. Think of the EU's single market as a vast, modernized version of the Hanseatic trade network, where the League abolished internal tolls between member cities and enforced common weights and measures. The EU abolishes internal tariffs and harmonizes product regulations. Where Hanseatic merchants enjoyed legal protection in foreign contours, EU citizens enjoy the right to live, work, and do business in any member state. The foundational principle is identical. Economic cooperation and integration create stability and prosperity that isolated entities cannot achieve alone. This is not a perfect parallel, of course. The EU has a formal bureaucracy, a parliament, and a court of justice, structures the nebulous Hanseatic could never have conceived. Yet the essential spirit, the pragmatic understanding that borders can be softened for commerce without erasing national identity, is a direct descendant of the Hanseatic model. It is supranational cooperation built on economic necessity, not on dreams of political empire. Within modern Germany itself, the Hanseatic spirit lives on in a tangible political form. The cities of Hamburg and Bremen, along with Lübeck until the 1930s, carried the title Free and Hanseatic City into the modern era. This was not just a nostalgic label. When Germany unified in 1871, Hamburg and Bremen negotiated fiercely to enter not as mere provinces, but as full federal states, retaining control over their historic ports as exclusive customs zones. This status granted them a unique degree of self-governance and a powerful, independent voice in the national federation. Their civic identity remained deeply intertwined with their mercantile past, a legacy of looking outward to the sea and the world rather than solely inward to a national capital. They are living proof that the League's legacy was not just in trade, but in a durable idea of urban autonomy. That legacy even has a modern, self-conscious revival. In 1980, the city of Zwolle in the Netherlands initiated the Hanseatic League of the new time. This is not a political or economic union, but a cultural and tourism network that now includes over 190 towns across Europe that were once part of the historical league. They host festivals, student exchanges, and economic conferences celebrating their shared heritage. While symbolic, this network underscores how the Hanseatic idea still resonates as a positive model of cross-border connection. It reminds us that the ties forged by commerce can create lasting cultural bonds that transcend the rise and fall of nations. So what does this recurring pattern tell us? The Hanseatic League presents a powerful alternative model in European history, one that sits between total isolation and full political unification. It is the model of the network, the alliance, the common market. It argues that profound unity can be achieved not through conquest or the surrender of identity, but through the meticulous, pragmatic weaving together of mutual interests. From the foggy wharves of medieval Lübeck to the glass corridors of modern Brussels, the same fundamental insight persists. When security and prosperity are linked across borders, everyone gains. The League's true triumph may be that its most successful invention was not the cog ship or the bill of exchange, but a timeless blueprint for cooperation, one that Europe, in its search for peace and prosperity, has instinctively returned to again and again. The silent ledgers are finally speaking, translated by lines of code. While fire destroyed the physical archive, a new kind of excavation is underway, one that mines not the seabed but the scattered data points left behind. Historians armed with algorithms are now reconstructing the ghostly anatomy of the Hanseatic League using the tools of the 21st century, a field known as digital humanities or computational history. They are feeding every surviving fragment, every ship's manifest, every recorded legal adoption of Lübeck law, every mention of a merchant in a foreign court record into vast databases. The goal is not to find a single smoking gun document, but to discern the hidden patterns in the noise, to see the forest when so many of the trees have been lost. This is network theory applied to the past. Each city becomes a node, a point on a digital map. Every trade route, every letter between merchants, every shared legal code becomes a link, a line connecting those points. When you visualize this data, something remarkable happens. The Hanseatic League, so often described as shadowy and nebulous, suddenly materializes as a precise, shimmering web of influence. Lübeck blazes at the center, a super hub with thick connections radiating in every direction. You can see secondary hubs like Hamburg and Bruges pulsing with activity. And you can identify the critical bridges, cities like Cologne that served as vital connectors between the maritime Baltic network and the riverine systems of the Rhineland, their unique position explaining their frequent defiance of Lübeck's wishes. These digital models allow historians to run simulations, to ask what-if questions that the burned archives can never answer. How quickly would news of a Danish embargo spread from Lübeck to Riga, given the known sailing times and the pattern of correspondence? They can simulate the shock of removing a key node, like the closure of the Novgorod contour, and watch how the network reroutes or fails to reroute its flows of goods and information. This quantitative approach reveals the League's inherent resilience and its fatal vulnerabilities. The network was incredibly robust against random failure. If one small port dropped out, others could easily take its place. But it was terrifyingly fragile to targeted attack on its hubs. The simulations show that if Lübeck had been militarily conquered or its port blockaded for a sustained period, the entire web would have likely shattered into disconnected regional clusters because so much of the trust, law, and coordination flowed through that single central point. The data also challenges old assumptions. By analyzing the adoption dates of Lübeck law across hundreds of towns, mapped against their trade volumes, researchers can see that legal integration often followed commercial connection, not the other way around. Cities traded first and then adopted the common legal framework to deepen and secure that relationship. The digital maps also make the League's slow decline viscerally clear. Over time, the thick, vibrant lines connecting the core Baltic cities begin to thin and fade. New, bright lines start to appear, bypassing the Hanseatic hubs entirely. Direct connections from English ports to Baltic producers or from Dutch flights to Russian suppliers. The network doesn't violently explode, it simply atrophies as new, more efficient routes are carved out around its edges. This is history viewed not through the lens of kings and treaties, but through the mathematics of connection and flow. It allows us to move beyond the stories of individual merchants or dramatic sieges and understand the League as a complex system, one that thrived on dense interconnectivity and died when that connectivity was no longer the fastest or cheapest option. The digital Hans is a phantom made of light on a screen, but it may be the closest we will ever come to seeing the invisible empire as its merchants truly knew it, a living, breathing circuit board of medieval commerce. The paradox of the Hanseatic League is its greatest lesson. This was a stateless state, a peaceful alliance that could raise fleets and topple kings, a conservative guild system that invented the financial tools of the modern world. It rose not by conquest, but by connection, by filling the power vacuum left by fractured kingdoms and offering something more valuable than force, reliability. Its merchants mastered the brutal logistics of the northern seas, turning timber, fish, and wax into the building blocks of an economy, while their coded letters and fortified contours created an intelligence network faster than any royal courier. Their power was always soft, woven from trust and mutual profit, until the moment it needed to be hard as iron, as the Treaty of Stralsund proved. Yet that same decentralized nature, its greatest strength, became its fatal flaw. When faced with the unified purpose of rising nation-states and the nimble competition of Dutch entrepreneurs, the League's cities could not sacrifice their local interests for the collective good. They debated while the world sailed past. The internal squabbles, like the schism with Cologne, revealed a network that could enforce an embargo but could not forge a unified future. Its fall was not a dramatic collapse, but a slow fading, like a once vital web gently dissolving in the rain. but to say it simply vanished would be to miss the point entirely. The League's legacy is etched into our world. Walk through the old towns of Lübeck, Tallinn, or Gdansk, and you are walking through a museum of its ambition, in every red brick gable and soaring Gothic vault. More profoundly, our global economy runs on systems it helped pioneer. The bill of exchange that let money move without coins, the maritime insurance that pooled risk, the standardized contracts and quality controls. These are the direct ancestors of our international trade law and banking. The very idea of a common market where borders are softened for mutual economic gain finds a clear echo in the European Union, a peaceful coalition built on shared interest rather than shared sovereignty. So what are we left with after this journey through foggy ports and sunken cogs? A reminder that history's most transformative forces are not always the loudest. Empires rise with fanfare and fall in fire, but the quiet, relentless work of merchants, accountants, and shipwrights can weave networks that outlast dynasties. The Hanseatic League proves that trust can be a currency, that cooperation can be a superpower, and that sometimes the most enduring empires are the ones you cannot draw on a map. They were a phantom with real weight, a whisper that shaped a continent. What do you think was the League's most fascinating secret? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's greatest mysteries.